The ex-policeman wanted one last goodbye with his dog in court. What followed stunned everyone. Jack Malone had spent most of his life serving as a dedicated police officer in the small town of Willow Creek. Known for his sharp instincts and an unyielding sense of justice, he had built his career on catching criminals and keeping his community safe. But Jack always said that his greatest partner wasn't a human, it was Shadow, his loyal German Shepherd canine companion. For 8 years, Shadow and Jack had been inseparable. Together, they had solved countless cases, from drug busts to missing person searches. Shadow wasn't just a working dog, he was Jack's family, his confidant, and his closest friend. But time wasn't kind to either of them. Shadow grew older, his once quick movements slowed by arthritis. Jack, too, faced challenges. A bullet wound from a confrontation with a dangerous fugitive had left him with a permanent limp, forcing him into early retirement. Though retired, Jack had hoped to spend his remaining years with Shadow by his side. However, canine dogs like Shadow were technically owned by the police department, and regulations stated that upon retirement, they were to be reassigned or, in rare cases, auctioned. Jack's heart broke when he learned Shadow was to be reassigned to another handler, a decision that left him sleepless for weeks. Determined not to let Shadow go without a fight, Jack filed a petition in court, asking to officially adopt Shadow. He argued that after years of risking their lives together, they deserved to spend their remaining time as family. The courtroom was packed the day of the hearing, with many locals coming to support the retired officer and his beloved dog. As the proceedings began, the opposing side presented their case. They argued that Shadow was still fit for duty and could serve the community better under a younger, active handler. It was a compelling argument, but Jack wasn't ready to give up. When it was his turn to speak, he stood with Shadow by his side, his voice trembling with emotion. "Shadow isn't just a dog," Jack said, his eyes glistening with tears. "He's my partner. He's saved my life more times than I can count. He's grown old serving this town, and all I want is to give him the peaceful, loving retirement he's earned. Shadow doesn't deserve to be separated from the only family he's ever known." The judge listened intently, her face unreadable. Then, something extraordinary happened. Shadow, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, moved closer to Jack, rested his head on his partner's lap, and let out a soft, almost human sigh. The courtroom fell silent. Even the sternest faces softened. The judge leaned forward, a faint smile on her lips. "Mr. Malone, it's clear to me that Shadow is more than just a canine officer. His family. I see no reason to separate the two of you. Shadow is hereby retired and officially transferred to your care." Cheers erupted in the courtroom. Jack knelt down and embraced Shadow, whispering, "We did it, buddy. We're going home." That day, Jack and Shadow walked out of the courthouse together, greeted by a crowd of supporters who had gathered outside. What followed was a peaceful retirement for the pair. They spent their days walking through the woods, enjoying the quiet moments they had missed during their years of service. Their story became a symbol of loyalty, love, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog, reminding everyone in Willow Creek and beyond that sometimes, justice isn't just about laws. It's about doing what's right. Months after the emotional courtroom victory, Jack and Shadow found a quiet rhythm to their lives. The mornings were filled with walks by the river, and the afternoons often involved sitting on Jack's porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills of Willow Creek. Shadow's playful bark still echoed through the neighborhood, though it had grown softer with age. But life rarely stays quiet for long. One day, as Jack and Shadow strolled through the woods, they came across an abandoned cabin. The door was ajar, and signs of recent activity, footprints, cigarette butts, and discarded food wrappers hinted that someone had been there. Jack's instincts kicked in immediately. Though retired, the cop in him could never truly rest. Shadow, too, sniffed the air, his ears perking up. "Looks like trouble, buddy," Jack murmured. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped closer. Shadow followed, his tail low, signaling caution. Jack noticed a faint glow coming from inside the cabin, a flickering light, likely from a lantern or candle. Peering through the crack in the door, he saw two men hunched over a map, their voices low but intense. "Smugglers," Jack whispered to himself. He had heard rumors of a group operating near the state line, using the dense forest as a hideout. Could this be them? Jack backed away slowly, pulling Shadow with him. His heart raced, but his mind was already strategizing. He couldn't handle this alone. Reporting the sighting to his old colleagues at the precinct was the obvious choice. But a thought gnawed at him. What if these men fled before help arrived? Shadow growled softly, breaking Jack's train of thought. A third figure had emerged from the woods, heading toward the cabin with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Jack froze. The situation was escalating quickly. What would happen next? Would Jack's sense of duty pull him back into the line of fire? And could Shadow, despite his age, rise to the occasion once more to protect his beloved partner? Their peaceful retirement seemed far from over. Something big was brewing in Willow Creek, and Jack and Shadow were about to be swept back into the action. Jack Malone had spent his entire career serving the small town of Willow Creek, but nothing had prepared him for the silence of retirement. It wasn't the absence of routine or the lack of action that weighed on him most, it was the thought of losing Shadow, his loyal canine partner. For 8 years, Shadow had been more than just a dog. He had been Jack's confidant, his protector, and his closest friend. When the day came for Jack to retire, he'd hoped to bring Shadow home with him. But the department had other plans. Regulations stated that Shadow, still fit for duty, would be reassigned to another handler. The thought of parting with him was unbearable. Shadow had saved Jack's life on more occasions than he could count. The bond they shared wasn't something that could be transferred like a badge or uniform. Jack tried every official channel to change the decision, but bureaucracy wouldn't budge. With no other options, he filed a petition with the court, requesting custody of Shadow. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was filled with townspeople who had come to support Jack, a testament to the respect he and Shadow had earned over the years. The opposition argued their case convincingly. Shadow was still an asset to the department and could continue serving the community with a new handler. But when it was Jack's turn to speak, he poured his heart out. "Shadow isn't just a dog," Jack began, his voice steady despite the emotion welling inside him. "He's my partner. We've faced danger together, saved lives together, and stood side by side through everything. After everything he's done for this town, all I want is to give him the peace and love he deserves in his final years." As Jack spoke, Shadow sat beside him, his eyes fixed on his partner as if understanding every word. The courtroom was silent, every person hanging on Jack's heartfelt plea, and then, as if to punctuate the moment, Shadow moved closer to Jack, rested his head on his lap, and let out a soft sigh. The judge, visibly moved, nodded. "It's clear to me that Shadow belongs with you. Custody is granted to Mr. Malone. Thank you both for your service." A wave of relief washed over Jack as cheers erupted in the courtroom. Shadow wagged his tail, oblivious to the legal victory but sensing Jack's happiness. They walked out of the courthouse together, greeted by the townspeople who had rallied behind them. 4 months, Jack and Shadow enjoyed a peaceful retirement. They spent their days exploring the woods, fishing by the river, and savoring the quiet life they had earned. But one fateful day, while walking along an overgrown trail, Jack noticed something unusual: footprints leading to an old, forgotten cabin. The door was slightly ajar, and faint voices drifted out. Jack's instincts flared. Shadow, though older and slower, perked up beside him, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Quietly, Jack crept closer and peered through the crack in the door. Inside, 2 men sat at a table, their conversation low but tense. Scattered across the surface were stacks of cash, a map, and what looked like a bag of stolen jewelry. Jack's heart raced. He knew he should call the authorities, but something stopped him. Shadow growled softly, alerting him to a third figure approaching the cabin from the woods, carrying a duffel bag. The situation was escalating, and Jack realized he was once again standing at the edge of danger. Shadow stood at his side, his body tense, ready for action. The peaceful life they had built together now seemed like a distant memory as Jack prepared for what was to come. Jack's heart raced as he crouched behind the trees, watching the third man approach the cabin. Shadow remained silent, his instincts as sharp as ever despite his age. Jack knew he was outnumbered, unarmed, and miles away from backup. Yet, The thought of walking away never crossed his mind. Shadow let out a low growl, his body taut with anticipation. Jack placed a hand on his companion's head, silently reassuring him. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "We'll figure this out." His mind raced through the options. He could retreat and call the authorities, but by the time they arrived, the smugglers might already be gone. Or he could take a risk, a big one. Jack glanced at Shadow, whose eyes were locked on the cabin door, waiting for his cue. They'd been through worse before, but this time, Jack wasn't sure if they could come out unscathed. Jack took a deep breath and decided to act. Jack took a deep breath, his pulse pounding in his ears as he whispered to Shadow, "Stay close, buddy. We've got one shot at this." Shadow's ears twitched, his focus unwavering. He crept closer to the cabin, sticking to the shadows as the third man entered. The voices inside grew louder, their tone heated. Jack could make out snippets of their conversation, something about a delivery, a deal gone wrong, and someone getting impatient. Shadow suddenly tensed, his nose twitching. Jack turned his head just in time to see movement behind them, a fourth figure emerging from the woods, scanning the area with a flashlight. Jack's heart sank. They were surrounded. Shadow growled softly, and Jack's grip tightened on the branch he'd picked up as a makeshift weapon. This wasn't going to be easy. Jack pressed his back against a tree, holding his breath as the flashlight beam swept dangerously close. Shadow remained motionless, his training kicking in as he stayed silent and alert. The fourth man muttered something under his breath before moving further into the woods, his footsteps fading into the distance. Jack exhaled slowly, signaling Shadow to follow as they edged closer to the cabin. Inside, the men's argument had escalated, voices sharp and angry. Jack strained to listen, catching phrases like missing shipment and time's running out. His gut told him this wasn't just a petty smuggling operation. Whatever was happening here was bigger and more dangerous than he'd anticipated. But before Jack could decide his next move, the cabin door slammed open. One of the men stormed out, his hand resting on a holstered gun. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the darkness. Jack froze, gripping Shadow's collar tightly. The tension crackled in the air as the man took a step in their direction. And then, Shadow shifted ever so slightly, his growl barely audible but enough to make Jack's stomach drop. They had seconds before they'd be discovered. The man's head snapped in their direction, his eyes narrowing as he reached for his weapon. Jack's heart thundered in his chest. He crouched lower, pulling Shadow close. "Who's there?" the man called out, his voice sharp and commanding. He took another step forward, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots echoing in the stillness of the woods. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't afford to make a sound, but staying hidden was becoming impossible. Shadow, sensing the danger, tensed, his body coiled like a spring. The man raised his flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness, inching closer to their hiding spot. Jack tightened his grip on Shadow's collar, silently willing his companion to hold steady. Just as the light was about to hit them, a sharp whistle came from the cabin. "Hey, get back here," one of the other men shouted. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking back toward the cabin. After a moment, he cursed under his breath and turned, jogging back toward the others. Jack let out a slow, controlled exhale. They'd bought themselves a moment, but the danger was far from over. Whatever was happening in that cabin was bigger than he'd anticipated, and he wasn't sure how much longer he and Shadow could stay undetected. It was clear now, they couldn't just walk away. With the man's footsteps fading into the distance, Jack motioned for Shadow to follow him. They remained low, creeping through the underbrush, staying close to the shadows of the trees. The cabin loomed ahead, its dim light flickering through the cracks in the wooden walls. Jack's mind raced. This wasn't just a chance encounter anymore, it was a ticking clock. "All right, Shadow," Jack whispered, his voice tight. "We need to get inside, get the intel, and get out. We're not doing this the hard way." Shadow, ever faithful, stayed by his side, his body tense but moving with precision, his paws barely making a sound. Jack crept closer to the edge of the cabin, peeking through a gap in the wood. The men inside were still arguing, their voices muffled but rising in volume. One of them suddenly slammed a fist on the table. "We don't have time for this. We need the product delivered tonight, or we're all dead. Jack's gut twisted. This wasn't a simple smuggling ring. These men were mixed up in something far more dangerous, something that could have deadly consequences if left unchecked. Taking a deep breath, Jack motioned for Shadow to stay back as he edged around to the back of the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. If they were going to get the evidence they needed, it had to be now. With one final glance at Shadow, Jack pushed the door open slowly, wincing as the old hinges creaked. Inside, the men were distracted, poring over what appeared to be a series of maps and documents. Jack's eyes quickly scanned the room, landing on a large duffel bag sitting in the corner. He moved quietly, his muscles tense with each step, when suddenly, a noise behind him. Jack spun around, just in time to see one of the men emerge from a back room. What the hell? Before he could react, Shadow lunged, teeth bared, and in one swift motion, the man was on the ground, pinned by the seasoned K9. Jack's heart raced. He knew the risk they were taking. There was no turning back now. The man struggled beneath Shadow's weight, but the dog's hold was unyielding. Jack didn't waste a second. He lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm and pulling it behind his back, forcing him to the floor. "Stay down," Jack barked, his voice low but commanding. The man froze, fear in his eyes as he realized he was no match for Jack and Shadow. The other voices in the cabin grew louder. Two of the men had heard the scuffle and were rushing toward the back room. Jack's heart pounded. He couldn't afford to be caught here. Not like this. "Shadow, stay," Jack whispered urgently, giving the command. Shadow growled softly, his body still tense but obedient. Jack glanced at the duffel bag in the corner. It was too important to leave behind. He couldn't afford to leave the evidence to chance. He moved quickly, grabbing the duffel bag and slinging it over his shoulder just as the door to the back room slammed open. "Hey!" one of the men shouted. "What the hell is going on back there?" Without missing a beat, Jack shoved the man still pinned by Shadow aside and bolted for the window. The second man lunged at him, but Jack was already moving. With Shadow at his heels, Jack dove through the window, landing hard on the ground outside, the bag in tow. The crash behind him told him they were coming. Jack's limbs screamed with the effort, but he didn't stop. They had to get out of there, fast. "Go, Shadow," Jack shouted, his voice hoarse as he pushed forward. Shadow was at his side in an instant, running full speed as the sound of boots pounding the ground echoed behind them. They didn't look back. Through the dense forest they ran, the night air biting at their skin, the adrenaline coursing through their veins. Jack's mind was focused solely on one thing: getting to safety. The bag he carried was their only hope, the key to unraveling the dark secrets these men were hiding. As they neared the edge of the woods, Jack risked a glance over his shoulder. He didn't see anyone chasing them. For now, they had bought themselves a little time. But Jack knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He turned to Shadow, who was panting beside him, his tail wagging slightly despite the chase. "Good job, boy. Let's get out of here." But as they moved deeper into the woods, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Something told him that this was only the beginning. Jack quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the dark woods around them. The weight of the duffel bag felt heavier with every step, but the thought of what it contained pushed him forward. The men in the cabin had been talking about a shipment, and from the way they reacted when they realized someone was inside, Jack knew that bag was crucial. It wasn't just filled with stolen goods, it was likely the key to exposing something far more dangerous. Shadow trotted beside him, his breathing heavy but steady. The K9 had been through countless chases and fights, but Jack could feel the toll of age on him. They had to find safety, and fast. As they neared the edge of the forest, Jack's instincts flared. He wasn't alone. The crunch of leaves underfoot, subtle, deliberate, told him someone was following. Jack's hand instinctively dropped to his side, reaching for the knife he'd tucked into his belt before heading out that evening. "Shadow," Jack whispered, his voice low, "stay alert." The dog stopped in his tracks, ears raised, and then he growled, a deep, rumbling sound that sent a chill through Jack. Shadow's gaze fixed on a thicket of trees just ahead. Someone was there. Jack's mind raced. It could be one of the men from the cabin, or worse, someone else entirely. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, and the nagging sensation that they weren't going to make it out without a fight. "Who's there?" Jack called out, trying to steady his breathing. His hand tightened around the knife, ready to act. There was a moment of silence. Then, a voice broke through the tension. "It's me." Jack's eyes narrowed, but the voice sounded familiar. He stepped forward cautiously, keeping Shadow close. As he emerged into a small clearing, he saw a figure stepping out of the shadows. It was Deputy Ellie Foster. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jack asked, his heart still racing. He had known Ellie for years. She had been a rookie when he was still on the force, and they had worked a few cases together. But something about her presence here felt off, something wasn't right. "I could ask you the same thing," Ellie replied, her face unreadable. "You're walking into something you don't understand, Jack." Before Jack could respond, there was a rustle in the trees behind them. More footsteps. Closer this time. Ellie's eyes flicked nervously toward the noise, and for a split second, Jack saw something in her expression, fear. It wasn't like her. "Get down," Ellie hissed, pulling Jack and Shadow behind a large boulder just as figures appeared in the clearing. The two men from the cabin. Jack's blood ran cold. They had been tracking him, but how had they found him so quickly? His mind spun as he realized that Ellie's sudden appearance, her cryptic warning, it all made sense now. Ellie had been following him. She wasn't here to help him, she was here to make sure he didn't get away. The realization hit Jack like a punch to the gut. Ellie, the rookie he had trusted, the deputy who had once been his ally, she was working with them. The men from the cabin had known exactly where to find him, and now they were closing in fast. Ellie's hand shot out, gripping Jack's arm. "You have to trust me," she whispered urgently. "This is bigger than you think." Jack shook his head, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What the hell is going on, Ellie? You're working with them? After everything we've been through?" She didn't answer immediately, her eyes darting back to the approaching figures. One of the men, the taller one, spoke up, his voice carrying through the quiet woods. "Ellie, we know you're out here. There's nowhere left to hide. We don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Jack's blood ran cold. Ellie's face remained stoic, but Jack could see the tension in her shoulders. The way her hand trembled ever so slightly as she held him back, it told him everything. She was trapped. The fear in her eyes wasn't for herself, but for what was about to unfold. "You're not making this easier, Ellie," Jack said, his voice low and steady, though his mind was racing. "This isn't you. What's going on here? What are they involved in?" Ellie glanced over at Jack, her face shadowed by the dim light, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted this, Jack. I didn't have a choice." But the words were already too late. The two men had reached the clearing. They stopped when they saw Jack and Ellie crouched behind the rock, a mixture of disbelief and anger flashing across their faces. "Ellie, what are you doing?" the shorter one barked, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "You were supposed to keep him from getting away, not hide with him." Ellie swallowed, her gaze shifting between Jack and the men. She took a deep breath and stood. The taller man shook his head, muttering a curse. "You've made your choice. Now you'll have to live with it." Ellie turned to Jack, her face a mix of regret and determination. "I didn't have a choice, Jack. I had to do what they said. Or they'd hurt my family." Jack's heart ached for her. He knew what it was like to be caught between loyalty and fear. But they couldn't let this go any further. The air between them was thick with tension, the sound of the night crickets barely audible over the beating of Jack's heart. Shadow stood beside him, teeth bared, sensing the danger. Jack glanced at Ellie, his mind working quickly. "There's still a way out of this," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "Help me, and we can expose them, together." But before Ellie could respond, the sound of more footsteps reached their ears, closer, faster. And this time, Jack knew they didn't have much time. The game had changed. And now, they were running out of options. Ellie's gaze flickered nervously toward the approaching footsteps, and Jack felt a sudden rush of urgency. The men from the cabin were not the only ones closing in. The air around them felt charged, like the calm before a storm. The shadows in the woods seemed to stretch longer, as though the night itself was closing in on them. I don't have much time, Jack muttered, taking a step toward Ellie. You know we can't win this if we keep playing both sides. Help me, and we can bring this whole thing down. Ellie's eyes darted between Jack and the two men standing at the edge of the clearing. The shorter one was reaching for his radio, his hand steady but his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He wasn't ready to trust her, maybe he never would be. But Ellie didn't answer. Her breath was shallow, her fingers twitching as if she was caught in a mental struggle. Jack could feel the weight of her decision hanging in the air. Ellie, we don't have to do this, Jack said, his voice softening. Help me. I can protect you. I won't let them hurt you. For a moment, it seemed like she might respond. Jack's heart thudded louder in his chest, every muscle in his body on high alert. But before Ellie could speak, the tall man finally snapped. Enough, he barked, his hand lifting to signal the others. We don't have time for this. We get the bag, and we leave. You're with us, or you're against us, Ellie. Make your choice. The words hung in the air, a sharp ultimatum that echoed through the woods. Jack felt the pressure building. Ellie was running out of time, and so was he. If they didn't act fast, they'd all be caught in this trap. Ellie, listen to me, Jack said urgently, stepping closer. You don't owe them anything. We can fix this, but you have to trust me. Ellie's lips parted, her face a study in conflict. Her eyes met Jack's, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of hope in them. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, the short man suddenly advanced. You heard him, Ellie. No more games. Without warning, the man lunged at Jack. Everything happened in a blur. Shadow reacted instantly, leaping forward and sinking his teeth into the man's arm, forcing him back with a roar of pain. The tall man pulled out a gun, aiming it directly at Jack. Ellie's hand moved instinctively, drawing her own weapon, but she hesitated. Her eyes flicked between the gun in her hand and Jack's pleading expression. The tension in the air snapped. Shadow growled fiercely, holding the shorter man in a vice grip. Jack knew they had only seconds before things spiraled further. Ellie, now! Jack shouted. Ellie's finger hesitated on the trigger, her eyes locked on Jack. Finally, she made her choice. With a sharp movement, she aimed her gun toward the tall man and fired once. The bullet missed his head by mere inches but sent him stumbling back in surprise. Run! Jack yelled. He grabbed Ellie's arm and pulled her away from the chaos, with Shadow at their heels. The night was alive with the sound of footsteps, shouting, and gunfire, but they didn't look back. They couldn't. Jack's mind raced as they sprinted through the dense woods, the bag of evidence still clutched in his hand. They needed to disappear, fast. The game was only getting more dangerous, and they had no idea what awaited them at the end of the road. But one thing was clear, the story wasn't over yet. They ran through the night, the sounds of pursuit fading as they plunged deeper into the wilderness. The woods seemed endless, a labyrinth of trees and undergrowth, but Jack and Ellie were moving on instinct, fueled by the adrenaline of their escape. Shadow, still at their side, kept a steady pace, the familiar thud of his paws reassuring Jack that they weren't alone in this fight. Ellie stumbled slightly, the weight of the gun and the situation clearly taking its toll. I didn't think it would go this far, Jack, she gasped, her breath sharp in the cold air. I thought I was just trying to get information, keep an eye on things. I didn't think they were this deep into something. Jack kept his gaze fixed ahead, focusing on putting distance between them and the men they had left behind. They've been pulling strings for a long time, Ellie. And you've been caught in the middle. But you did the right thing. Ellie's voice trembled as she spoke, her words laced with regret. I should have never gone along with it. I thought I could protect my family, but now they're involved, too. I don't know how to fix this. Jack looked at her, his expression softening despite the urgency of their situation. We'll fix it. We just need to get to the truth. We need to bring down whatever's going on with this shipment, this whole operation. They can't hide it forever. He looked down at the bag he was still clutching. The contents of that bag were their only shot at unraveling the conspiracy that had ensnared Ellie and countless others. The documents inside could expose the people behind the operation, but they needed to get to safety first. The men they had left behind wouldn't stop, Not now. It was only a matter of time before they regrouped and came after them. The sound of footsteps returned, faint at first but growing louder. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They were being followed again, and this time, they couldn't afford to outrun them forever. "We can't keep running like this," Jack muttered, glancing around at the dense woods. "We need a plan. Now." Ellie's gaze darted nervously, her mind clearly working through their options. "We need to get to a place where we can make contact with the outside world. But it's too risky to use phones, they'll track us." Jack nodded. They had to find a way to turn the tables. "We need to find a safe house. Someone we can trust." They pushed forward, urgency in their steps. The trees around them blurred into a streak of dark shadows as they ran, but their chances of losing the pursuers were growing slimmer by the second. And just when Jack thought they might escape, a figure stepped into their path. "Not so fast," a familiar voice called from the shadows. Jack's heart sank. The last thing they needed was another confrontation. But the figure emerging from the darkness wasn't one of the men from the cabin. It was someone far more unexpected. "David." Jack's voice barely escaped his throat. David, a former colleague and close friend from his days on the force, stepped forward, a look of grim determination on his face. "You need to stop running, Jack. We need to talk." Jack's breath caught in his throat as he stared at David. The last time he had seen his old friend, things had been different. They'd parted ways after Jack's departure from the force, but never had he imagined David would be here, now, in the middle of this mess. "David, what the hell are you doing here?" Jack demanded, his pulse quickening. "This isn't your fight. You're not part of this." David's face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, concern, maybe even regret. "You're wrong, Jack. It is my fight. I've been trying to clean up the mess the department left behind, but you're walking into something that's bigger than you realize. You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack's mind raced. "Bigger than I realize? David, these guys are dangerous. They're involved in something illegal, something I need to expose. Why the hell would you want to protect them?" David looked over at Ellie, who had fallen silent, her expression unreadable. He sighed deeply. "I'm not protecting them, Jack. I'm trying to stop something worse from happening. This isn't just a local smuggling ring. There are people in high places who are involved. People who will do anything to make sure this stays hidden." Jack's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a case of corrupt criminals, they were connected to something deeper, something more dangerous. "Then help us," Jack said, desperation creeping into his voice. "You've got the connections, David. You've got the experience. Help me take them down." David's eyes darkened. "It's not that simple. I'm trying to stop this, but if you keep digging, you'll make yourself a target. You're already too deep in. They won't stop until you're gone." Ellie stepped forward, her voice shaky. "What do you mean? Who are they? Why is this happening?" David's gaze softened, but there was a weight to his words as he spoke. "It's not just about the shipment. It's about control, about power. People you wouldn't expect are involved. People who can make you disappear without anyone noticing. And you're not the only ones at risk. If they get their hands on that bag," he let the sentence trail off, but the meaning was clear. Jack clenched his fists. "So what, we just walk away? Let them win?" David shook his head. "I'm not saying that. But you need to be smart. I've been trying to gather information on them from the inside, but if they know I'm helping you—" "They already know, David," Jack cut in. "They knew I was coming before I even stepped foot in that cabin. And now they know we're on the run. There's no more inside. It's time we take this to the outside." David's eyes flickered with hesitation, and for the first time, Jack saw a crack in his former friend's composure. "There's no way out of this clean, Jack. You have no idea what you're up against." Just then, a noise from behind them, footsteps, fast and coming closer. Jack's heart dropped. The men from the cabin weren't far behind. They had to act now. "We don't have time to argue," Jack said urgently, looking at David. "You want to help? Then get us to safety. We're not running anymore." David hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Follow me. But stay close. This is the only shot we have. As they moved quickly through the trees, Jack's mind raced. David had always been the straight-laced one, the one who followed the rules. But now, with his help, they were stepping into a dangerous game, one where the rules had long since stopped applying. And as they hurried through the woods, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that their path was only going to lead them deeper into the web of corruption. No one was coming to save them. This was their fight, and no matter the cost, they had to finish it. They moved through the woods at a breakneck pace, with David leading the way, his steps sure and swift despite the uncertainty in the air. Jack and Ellie kept close, Shadow close behind, alert and watchful. The night was thick with tension, every rustling leaf and snapping twig making Jack's heart pound harder. David kept his voice low, but urgent. "We're almost there. Just a little further." Jack glanced at him, eyes narrowed. "Where exactly are we going?" David's gaze didn't meet his. "A safe house. Somewhere they won't find us immediately. It's not much, but it's enough for now." Ellie, still quiet, exchanged a look with Jack, her face etched with anxiety. She had no idea who to trust now. The man she thought she knew had just admitted to being involved in something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. David led them deeper into the woods, weaving through dense trees until, finally, they came upon a small cabin hidden in the shadows. It was unassuming, just a weathered wooden structure, nestled in a quiet clearing, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. David quickly ushered them inside, locking the door behind them. The inside was simple, a bare-bones shelter meant for survival, not comfort. There were only a few dusty chairs, a small stove, and a wooden table piled with papers and old files. "This place has been in my family for years," David explained quietly, setting down the rifle he had carried along. "We can lay low here for a while." Jack dropped the duffel bag onto the table with a thud. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He couldn't ignore the information inside, not when it was the key to taking down everything these men were involved in. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed a plan. "David, you have to understand," Jack said, pacing the small cabin. "I need to get this out, get the truth to the authorities. The longer we wait, the more people will get hurt. We can't just hide out here." David ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. "You're not hearing me, Jack. The moment we send that evidence to the authorities, we're as good as dead. You'll be marked. I've been trying to clean this up for years, but there's no safe way out anymore. There's only survival." Jack stopped in his tracks, locking eyes with David. "You don't get it, do you? Survival isn't enough. You can't hide from this forever. We need to bring it into the light, expose them for what they are." David's expression hardened. "And what if they come for you first? What if they come for Ellie?" He looked at Ellie, his voice softer now. "You don't know how far these people can reach." Jack's mind was racing. He knew what David was saying was true. They were walking a fine line, and the people behind the operation they had uncovered had enough power to make them disappear in an instant. But they couldn't back down now. "I'm not running anymore," Jack said, his voice firm. "This ends tonight." Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, quiet, but unmistakable. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the usual sound of the wind or animals outside. It was too deliberate. David froze, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his side. "Stay quiet," David whispered, his eyes wide with alarm. "They're here." Before Jack could respond, the door slammed open. A figure stood in the doorway. Tall. Lean. A silhouette silhouetted by the pale moonlight. "Did you really think you could hide from us?" The voice was calm, almost taunting. Jack's blood ran cold as the figure stepped forward. It was one of the men from the cabin, the one who had been calling the shots. "Time's up." The man stepped into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room with cold precision. Behind him, two more figures emerged from the shadows, each one carrying the same air of menace. "The door." The man stepped into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room with cold precision. Behind him, two more figures emerged from the shadows, each one carrying the same air of menace. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping Jack, Ellie, and David inside. For a moment, the cabin was silent, save for the distant hum of the wind outside. The tension in the room was palpable. Jack's mind raced, his hand instinctively moving toward his side, where the knife was tucked away. But even as his fingers brushed the handle, he knew it wouldn't be enough. They were outnumbered, and these men weren't here for a casual conversation. "Thought you could outrun us?" the man who had spoken earlier asked, his lips curling into a smirk. "You're not that lucky." David's hand hovered near his own gun, but he hesitated, his eyes darting between Jack and the intruders. "We don't want any trouble," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man laughed, the sound hollow and cold. "Trouble's already here, David. You should have known better." Jack stepped forward, keeping his voice calm. "What do you want?" The man's eyes narrowed. "It's not about what we want, Jack. It's about what you have. That bag." He motioned toward the duffel bag sitting on the table. "You can't take that with you. It's already too late." Ellie's hand trembled at her side, and Jack could see the fear in her eyes. They had been so close to getting away, to exposing everything. But now, it seemed like their escape was slipping further out of reach. "You don't have to do this," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "If you let us go, we'll walk away. You'll never hear from us again." The man's expression didn't change. "That's not how this works, Jack. You're already too deep in. We can't let you live. But don't worry. It'll be quick." David's eyes flickered nervously, his hand still hovering over his weapon. "You don't have to do this, all right? We can work something out. We can." Before he could finish, the man raised a hand, signaling his two companions to move. In an instant, they had David pinned against the wall, his gun wrenched from his hand. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. They were out of time. If they didn't act now, they would be dragged deeper into this mess and they might not make it out alive. Ellie's eyes met Jack's, a silent understanding passing between them. They couldn't wait for an opportunity, they had to make their own. Jack reached into his jacket, pulling out the knife. With a swift movement, he lunged toward the nearest man, catching him off guard. The blade sank deep into the man's side, and he let out a strangled gasp before collapsing to the floor. The other two men reacted immediately, drawing their guns and aiming them at Jack. But before they could fire, Shadow lunged forward, snarling as he knocked one of the men to the ground. The dog's teeth sank into the man's arm, forcing him to drop his gun. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed the fallen weapon, aiming it at the remaining man. "Stay back," he warned, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The man hesitated, eyes flicking to the downed bodies of his companions. Then, without a word, he dropped his gun and raised his hands in surrender. "Smart move," Jack said, keeping the gun trained on him. "Now, get out." The man glared at him but didn't protest. He backed toward the door, his hands still raised. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You'll regret this." But Jack didn't wait for him to finish. As soon as the man stepped outside, Jack slammed the door shut and bolted it. He turned to Ellie and David, his breath heavy. "We don't have much time," Jack said, his voice urgent. "We have to get that evidence to the authorities, now." David nodded, though his face was grim. "We're not out of the woods yet. They'll be back, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Jack didn't answer. There was no time for words. They had one chance left, and they had to take it. The door suddenly rattled, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. "Get ready," Jack muttered. Because this time, they were going to fight until the very end. The heavy footsteps outside grew louder, a steady rhythm that sent a cold chill down Jack's spine. He turned toward David and Ellie, his gaze locking with theirs. No words were needed, they all understood what was at stake. David quickly moved to the window, peering out through the small gap between the wooden boards. "It's not just one or two of them," he said, his voice grim. "There's a whole damn squad closing in." Ellie's face paled. "How much time do we have?" "Minutes," David replied, his hand tightening around the rifle he had set down earlier. "We need to move fast, or we'll be trapped in here with nowhere to go." Jack's mind raced. The evidence in the bag was their only bargaining chip, and without it, they had nothing. The only option now was to fight their way out, but that would only buy them so much time. "We're not going out the front," Jack said, his voice low. He scanned the cabin quickly. "We need to find a way through the back. There's got to be a hidden route." David nodded, eyes darting to the rear of the cabin. "There's an old cellar entrance out back. It's overgrown, but it might give us a way out." They moved quickly, the weight of their footsteps the only sound in the otherwise quiet cabin. Shadow stayed close to Jack's side, his fur bristling with the anticipation of what was to come. As they neared the back door, Jack's instinct screamed that they were running out of time. David reached the door first, carefully opening it to reveal a small, overgrown path leading to the cellar entrance. The air outside was cooler, tinged with the smell of pine and earth, but the safety of the moment was fleeting. They had to move fast. "Stay low, and don't stop," David instructed. They crept through the underbrush, their steps careful, but the noise of their pursuers was already growing closer. Jack could feel the adrenaline coursing through him as he led the way down the overgrown path. The cellar entrance loomed ahead, a small trapdoor covered in layers of moss and dirt. David dropped to his knees and quickly cleared the debris, revealing the rusty hinges of the door. Without wasting a second, he yanked it open. "After you," Jack said, motioning for Ellie to go first. Ellie hesitated, then nodded, climbing down into the dark, musty cellar. Jack followed, pulling the trapdoor shut behind him just as a distant shout echoed through the woods. They had barely made it in time. The cellar was pitch black, the air thick with the scent of mildew and old wood. Jack could barely make out the shapes of crates and barrels lining the walls. But he wasn't concerned with the surroundings, only with the sounds of their enemies drawing closer. "Do you have a plan for this, David?" Jack asked in a hushed voice. David's breath was ragged as he glanced around the dark cellar. "We need to keep moving. There's an old escape tunnel beneath the cabin, one that leads out to the riverbank. If we're quick, we can get to the boat I left there." Jack frowned. "How do you know they won't be waiting for us down there?" "I don't," David admitted, his voice tight. "But it's the only shot we have." Without another word, they moved through the cellar, carefully navigating around the stacks of crates. As they reached the far side of the room, David's hand brushed against a section of the wall, revealing a narrow tunnel entrance hidden behind a stack of barrels. They squeezed through the narrow passageway, their bodies scraping against the cold stone walls. The further they went, the tighter it became, until Jack was almost forced to crawl. Minutes felt like hours as they wound their way through the underground tunnel. The air was stale, and Jack's muscles burned from the cramped space, but there was no turning back now. Finally, they emerged on the other side, into a small, concealed area by the riverbank. A weathered boat was tethered nearby, its wooden hull creaking gently in the current. Ellie exhaled sharply, her hand clutching the bag of evidence like it was the only thing that mattered. "We're almost there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But Jack's instincts were screaming. Something wasn't right. As they approached the boat, a voice called out from behind them, sharp and cold. "Did you really think you could escape?" Jack spun around, his heart sinking. The tall man from the cabin stood at the edge of the clearing, his gun raised and aimed directly at them. Behind him, two others emerged from the shadows, guns drawn. They had been outplayed, again. "You're not going anywhere," the man sneered. "The game's over." Jack's grip on the knife tightened. There was no more running. This was it. And just as he prepared to fight, the sound of an engine revving in the distance made his heart skip a beat. A familiar, unexpected sound. David looked at Jack, his eyes wide with realization. "We're not alone anymore." The sound of the engine grew louder, and Jack's heart beat faster. He knew that engine. He had heard it countless times before, during his days on the force. It was the unmistakable roar of a police vehicle, but this time it was not just any patrol car, it was the sound of something more. "Who the hell is that?" David muttered, his hand tightening around his weapon. The tall man with the gun didn't seem fazed. "Whoever it is, they're too late," he said with a mocking grin. "You're already surrounded." Jack's pulse raced as the sound of the engine drew closer. He wasn't sure if this was some last-minute rescue or a trick by someone who knew they were already cornered. But one thing was certain, they needed to move fast, or they would be caught in the crossfire. Just then, headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the riverbank. The vehicle skidded to a halt just behind them, and the engine cut off with a sharp roar. The tall man looked over his shoulder, confusion creeping into his features. What the hell is going on? Jack's hand flew to the gun at his side, prepared for whatever came next. But before he could make a move, the door to the vehicle opened, and a figure stepped out. A familiar face, but one Jack hadn't expected to see. "David, step away from them," the voice commanded. It was clear and authoritative, the tone of someone used to giving orders. David froze, his eyes widening. "No way, you? But how?" The figure stepped forward, the moonlight catching the badge clipped to their chest. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was Detective Taylor, a former colleague from the force. The one person Jack hadn't expected to walk through that door. Taylor's eyes flicked between Jack, Ellie, and the men with guns. She didn't flinch, her posture calm but with an edge of seriousness. "You've got no idea how deep this runs, Jack," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "But you're not going to get yourself killed over it." The tall man with the gun took a step back, eyeing Taylor with suspicion. "What's this? Another cop playing hero?" Taylor didn't flinch. "You're outnumbered. You've got two options. You can drop your weapons, or we can take you in the hard way." The standoff lasted only a few tense moments. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence faltering as Taylor's backup began to emerge from the shadows, emerging from the woods with more law enforcement personnel. "Not looking so good for you," Taylor said, her eyes locking on the leader of the group. The tall man growled, clearly frustrated, but he knew when to retreat. With a curse, he motioned to his men. "This isn't over. You'll regret this, Taylor." The three men turned and fled into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Jack let out a slow breath, the tension slowly ebbing from his body. "Taylor, what the hell? How did you find us?" Taylor's eyes softened slightly, though her voice remained steady. "I've been following the trail. Your old friend David reached out to me a while ago. We've been trying to take these guys down for months. But we couldn't risk blowing our cover until we were sure you'd lead us to the right people." David stood still for a moment, processing what she had said. Then, he sighed heavily, looking both relieved and exhausted. "I didn't want to drag you into this, Taylor. I thought I could clean it up without bringing in the whole department." "You did what you had to, David," Taylor said, her tone understanding. "But this was bigger than we all thought. You were right to contact me." Jack looked at Ellie, who still clutched the duffel bag tightly. "We've got the evidence. Everything they were hiding. It's all in here." Taylor's eyes flickered to the bag, and she nodded. "Good. That's what we came for. Are you going to take it from here?" Jack asked, still wary but feeling a sliver of hope. Taylor glanced back at the vehicle, where her team was already securing the area. "We're not out of the woods yet. But with this evidence, we've got the leverage we need. We'll make sure this operation is exposed, and we'll make sure it never happens again." Jack nodded, a mixture of relief and exhaustion settling over him. They had made it this far, and with Taylor's help, maybe, just maybe, they could bring this whole thing to light. The night wasn't over, but it felt like the first real victory in a long time. Taylor looked at Jack, then Ellie, her voice quiet but resolute. "We'll make sure you're safe. You did the right thing, both of you. But the road ahead is still going to be rough. You're not out of danger yet." Jack's grip on the gun slowly loosened, and he nodded. "We're ready for whatever comes next." And with that, the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, they had a fighting chance. As the tension in the air began to dissipate, Jack, Ellie, and David made their way to the police vehicle, their legs heavy with exhaustion, but their hearts lighter with hope. The evidence was finally in the right hands, and it felt like the weight of the world was slowly lifting off their shoulders. But deep down, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was just a brief reprieve. The men they had been up against weren't easily defeated. He knew that. They were powerful, resourceful, and dangerous. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. As they piled into the vehicle, Taylor gave her orders to the officers in her team, and they quickly began to clear the area. The night felt colder, more oppressive than before, as if the darkness itself was watching them, waiting for the next move. David sat beside Jack, looking more worn than Jack had ever seen him. "I didn't want you dragged into this, Jack," David muttered, his voice low and full of guilt. I should have told you sooner. Should have trusted you. Jack shot him a quick glance. You did what you thought was best. We're all in this now. No turning back. Ellie, sitting on the other side, looked out the window, her expression distant. What happens now? She asked quietly, her voice almost lost in the hum of the engine. As the vehicle sped down the dark roads, the uncertainty of what lay ahead lingered like a storm cloud. Jack knew they weren't safe yet. This was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. But with the evidence in their hands and Taylor's team now on their side, they had a fighting chance. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to relax, even just a little. He glanced at Ellie, who had fallen silent, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. They had made it this far. But the road ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The vehicle rounded a bend, and the lights of the distant town appeared on the horizon, signaling a brief return to safety. But Jack knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long. They would have to keep moving, keep fighting. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. Taylor reached for it, her fingers pressing the button as she listened intently. Detective Taylor, we've got a situation, a voice on the other end said, urgency in its tone. We just intercepted a communication, someone's already after you. They're tracking your movements. Jack's heart dropped into his stomach. How could they? Stay calm, Jack, Taylor cut him off, her voice now all business. We're one step ahead. But we need to move fast. Before Jack could say another word, the car swerved, turning sharply off the road into a narrow, wooded path. Ellie let out a startled gasp, grabbing the edge of the seat as the tires crunched against the gravel. What the hell? David muttered, his grip tightening on the door as Taylor accelerated. We're not going back to the station just yet, Taylor explained, her voice calm but urgent. We need to lay low for a while. We've got too much heat on us right now. Jack looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. They were in deeper than ever. And the people chasing them wouldn't stop until they were all either dead or silenced. The car sped down the winding road, the dark forest closing in on all sides. Jack didn't know where they were heading, but wherever it was, he knew it would be a temporary refuge, one that wouldn't last long. And in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He'd been a cop long enough to know that danger never took a break. And the enemies they were up against now were more relentless than anything he had ever encountered before. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, they couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. The game was only just beginning. And they had no choice but to play it to the end. The car tore through the forest, the engine roaring as Taylor expertly navigated the narrow, winding path. The trees blurred by in a greenish haze, and the sharp scent of pine filled the air. Jack's mind raced each turn, each bump in the road, seemed to take them further from safety, yet closer to whatever was waiting for them next. They needed a plan, and fast. David, his eyes still wide from the sudden shift, turned to Taylor. Where are we going? You can't keep us on the run forever. They're already onto us. What's next? Taylor's hands tightened on the wheel, her jaw set in determination. We're going to a safe house. It's off the grid, hidden. We can lay low there while we make sure the evidence is secured. Jack leaned forward in his seat. And after that? There's no going back after this, Taylor said quietly. Once the information gets out, the people we've been dealing with will come after us with everything they have. But we're going to make sure they don't win. The evidence is a game changer. Ellie, who had been quiet for most of the ride, finally spoke, her voice trembling. But what if it's not enough? What if they find us anyway? What if? Hey, Jack interrupted, his voice steady but fierce. We've made it this far. And we're not backing down now. This ends with them behind bars, not with us hiding in the shadows. Ellie nodded, her eyes burning with a resolve that matched his own. They couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. The fight was too big, too important. It was for their futures, their lives, and the truth. After what seemed like hours, the car finally slowed as they reached a secluded cabin hidden deep within the forest. The place was old, with weathered wood and a small porch, but it had the air of a forgotten hideaway, exactly what they needed. They piled out of the vehicle, their movements quick and efficient as they gathered the evidence bag and headed inside. The cabin was sparse, but it was secure, at least for now. Inside, the dim light from a single overhead bulb cast long shadows across the room. Taylor locked the door behind them, pulling down the shades on every window. "All right," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We keep quiet, stay off the grid, and work fast. We'll need to contact the right people we can trust, but they can't trace us yet." Jack nodded, his mind already turning to what had to be done next. They had to get the evidence to the authorities, but not just any authorities. Those in charge were compromised. The right people, the ones who would take action without hesitation, had to be found. And finding them was going to take time. Time they didn't have. As Jack settled into the cabin's only chair, his eyes never left the door. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. The battle had only just begun. Ellie sat on the edge of a small cot, the duffel bag clutched tightly in her hands. She was exhausted, but there was a fire in her eyes, a promise that they would see this through. "Jack," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination, "we can't let them win. We've come too far." "We won't," he replied, his voice firm. "We can't afford to." Outside, the wind picked up, the trees swaying ominously as if nature itself was holding its breath. It was as if the world knew something was changing, something big. Inside the cabin, though, Jack and his team knew that they had taken their first real step toward making a difference. The storm wasn't over, but with the truth in their hands, they had the power to take it all down. But the fight wouldn't be easy. It would require everything they had, and then some. The enemies they had made were dangerous, with no mercy and no hesitation. But as Jack looked around the room at the people beside him, Ellie, David, and Taylor, he knew one thing for certain. They weren't in this alone. They were going to finish this. And when it was over, they'd make sure that justice finally found its way into the light. The road ahead was uncertain, but the fire inside Jack burned brighter than ever. The game was on. And this time, they were going to win.